Hello. So this is our introductory presentation about the elements and principles of design and art, and it's specific to how those things apply to painting. So this slide shows the elements of design or the elements of art, and I'd like you to think of them sort of as the ingredients in a recipe. So like if you're making cookies, you put in eggs and flour and sugar. So these are the same things. These are the elements that you use to create your art. So the parts of your recipe. So we have line, value, color, texture, form, which is three-dimensional, and shape, which is two-dimensional, and then space. And we can have both positive and negative space. The principles of design or the principles of art, I'd like you to think of as sort of the instructions in a recipe. So when you make cookies, it might say cream, butter, and sugar together. Beat in eggs. Those are like the directions, how you use the elements. So these are the directions, how you use the elements of art. So rhythm has to do with movement, emphasis and variety, balance, and there are multiple types of balance, symmetrical, asymmetrical, and also radial, proportion, and unity and harmony. And we're going to look at examples of these in just a minute. So rhythm in this piece is that idea of creating a sense of movement in the art. And it's often done by using the elements. So in the painting you see on the left with the girl with kind of the greenish face, the element of line is what creates the movement in the piece. The line of her dress, the line leads up into her shoulder, the line of her arm leaning on the bed. You could even argue that there's that sort of green line of her face and her hair leading up, and then it leads you back into the rest of the picture. So movement, rhythm. On the one on the right, it's a little harder to see, but lighting is really used. The side of the woman that's lighter leads your eye up and into the piece and into the balcony, and then the sweeping curve of the balcony leads you back around and through the painting. So rhythm is that idea of movement, and how are you going to get the viewer's eye to move through your piece. Emphasis is that idea of calling attention to some part of the painting. And so a lot of times emphasis is created with color. Sometimes it's created with contrast, which means the difference between light and dark. So if you look at the painting of the woman playing the, I think that's a lute, she is lit up with almost like this glowing light, and all the rest of the painting is really dark. So you notice her because she stands out from the background because of the lighting, so that contrast. This painting is by Artemisia Gentileschi, who painted in the Baroque period, and she actually was using a technique called chiaroscuro, which is Italian for this type of dramatic lighting. The painting on the right is by Francisco Goya, who's a Spanish painter, and he's painting this moment in May when this revolution was taking place. And so the thing that your eye goes to is the guy with his arms up with the white shirt. And he's the only one wearing white, which symbolizes surrender. He's trying to surrender, but the soldiers have already shot several of his comrades who are laying there. So the X, he's almost like in an X that marks the spot. Emphasis is created because of how he's standing, and also because of the colors that the artist used to paint this painting. So balance, I said that there's a couple different kinds of balance. The one on the left is called formal balance or symmetrical balance. The one on the right of the old woman is called informal balance, which means it just feels a little less formal. It's what we also call asymmetrical balance. So the one of the flowers on the left is painted by Georgia O'Keeffe, and she's pretty much got it fairly balanced. It's sort of divided down the middle, and she's equally created these two flowers. They're not exactly the same, but they're really close. The one on the right is called Whistler's Mother, and it's by James McNeill Whistler. The actual real name that he gave the painting is Composition in Gray and Black, but it's been it's known as Whistler's Mother because it's a painting of his mother. And so you can see that sort of capital L shape of the big block of black in the background. And then that zooms across horizontally towards the woman. And so the space is broken up in this kind of informal L shaped way that we call asymmetry. Another word for this type of balance is the rule of thirds. If you divide the painting in thirds vertically and horizontally, there is something of interest at where each of those lines intersect, and that's called the rule of thirds. Proportion is the relationship of objects to each other in a painting. So sometimes the artist exaggerates those proportions, as you see on the left side, where the woman's neck is really elongated, as is her arm. That painting is by Alberto, I think his name is Alberto Giacometti. And the one on the right is by Orozco, I'm sorry. And he is a painter from Colombia. And so in his painting, what he's done is he's made everyone who's important bigger, and everyone who's not as important is smaller. He's also made everyone look really fat. And in his culture, that is a sign of prosperity, a sign of wealth and importance. But if we look at it, we can see that the proportions are really weird looking. The baby looks almost adult-like. The little woman, the maid who's holding the baby, is much tinier, the size of a child, because she's seen as being less important. And then the mother and father are really large, but notice that only the father's face is facing us, not the mother. So there's a lot of symbolism in this picture through proportion. So again, proportion is the size of the different elements in the painting and their relationship to each other. So our first unit is going to be about value. And it's going to be about using color and learning how to blend your color. It's also going to be about craftsmanship, learning, we call that craftsmanship when you are learning how to use the media. In this case, it will be acrylic paint. You're also going to be looking at composition. How you design your page, how you break up the space is going to be really important. And you're going to learn about some composition techniques that are helpful. And then your concept, what's your idea for the painting? So this first one is a still life, which doesn't have a huge amount of symbolism to it, but you are going to be allowed to bring in your own objects. And so the objects that you bring in, as well as the colors that you choose to represent your painting, could potentially relate to an idea. And then monochromatic means mono, meaning one color, plus and then the word chroma means color. So monochromatic is one color. And so you're going to be choosing one color and mixing it with black to get the really dark shades, and then white to create the really light shades, what we call a tint. So when you add white to a color, it's a tint. When you add black to a color, it's a shade. So this is a value scale. You can see it starts with white over here on the left, goes all the way to black on the right. And the idea is that in your painting, you want to show that full range of value. But the difference in the painting you're going to do is you are going to be making this with color. So there will be color here in the center. Your pure color would be the middle tone that you would see. So this painting is also going to be about shapes. And so we have two different kinds of shapes. We have geometric shapes, which are usually man-made things. Buildings are geometric. Your books are geometric, etc. And then you have organic shapes, which usually come from nature. They often have curved lines. So the cloud here you see is more of an organic shape. The rectangle and circle, that's a geometric shape. So like I said, this painting is also about how you define the space. So how are you going to create positive space? Positive space is the objects that are there. And then how will you also create interesting negative space? Negative space is the space around the objects where nothing is. And sometimes if you do a really good job of making interesting negative space, it and almost thinking more about that than the positive space, it can help you make a really great painting. So one of those can define the other. Consider the placement of objects in your composition when you're trying to define those positive and negative spaces. Um, Another thing to think about is composition. So how are you going to set up your page? One of the best things you could do with a still life is to zoom in. Don't think you have to draw all of the objects. Zoom in on some of the more interesting things. Only show part of it. Sometimes that's really an interesting way to create a composition. Repetition can also be interesting, so perhaps you repeat something. If you get close to the edge of the page, instead of trying to squeeze it in, you want to let it run off the page naturally. Possibly enlarge something. Choose an unusual point of view. Do you have to just look at something head on, or could you stand up, or could you put it on the floor and look down at it? So change your point of view, and those are some composition techniques that will help you. I have a bunch more, and when you get into Canvas and see the assignment, you'll see some more of those. So painting terms in this unit, this is our first painting, and so I want you to learn a little bit about what the things are that we're using. So paint is made out of pigment to get the color, and pigment occurs naturally in nature. Back a long time ago, before paint was invented in tubes, they actually had to make their own pigment by getting the blocks of, like, they almost look like rocks, and they would chip at them and pound up the pigment and get it all powdery, and then they would mix it with what's called a vehicle, and the vehicle is what allows it to be mixable and turned into paint. So vehicle could be oil, it could be water, it could be eggs. Tempera paints have eggs in them, and so the vehicle is what mixes the pigment and helps it turn into paint. You'll be using a brush, and the brush is held together with what's called a ferrule, which is the metal part of the brush. It helps hold the bristles in place. And we'll talk a little bit about the brush sizes that you have to choose from, because the right shape and the right size of the brush matters. So looking at the shape and sizes of brushes for the job that you need to do. So this is your introduction to painting. We'll talk a lot more in class, but hopefully this will help you get started with some of your thinking. Thanks.